My name is Captain Sabrina Horton, and at 32, I believed I understood the meaning of justice. I was wrong. My father, Federal Judge Harrison Horton, is one of the most powerful judicial figures in America. He taught me one fundamental rule: the law is everything, and family loyalty comes first. So when I chose to marry Marcus, a construction foreman from a dusty Nevada town over a prestigious attorney from our social circle, it wasn't just rebellion, it was treason against 4 generations of judicial legacy. On my wedding day, my parents didn't show. Instead, I got a voicemail. My father's voice was cold as a gavel strike. Sabrina, I am presiding over a federal case that will set legal precedent for decades. I will not sacrifice judicial integrity for one of your impulsive decisions. They thought they could just write me off, treat me like a dismissed case. But they didn't know who was sitting in the front row of that small chapel. The photograph I sent them afterward made their phones ring non-stop for 3 days straight. But before I reveal what that photo showed, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe to follow the rest of this story. The air inside the Desert Rose Chapel in Henderson, Nevada, carried the scent of sage and sweet jasmine. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through simple stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. It was humble, a universe away from the marble courthouse chambers where my family conducted their lives like legal proceedings, formal, calculated, and always for the record. But here, it was warm. Here, I was home. The pews weren't filled with federal judges and their calculating spouses. They were filled with my real family, Marines from the 2nd Intelligence Battalion, their shoulders proud in dress blues. They were loud, uncompromisingly authentic, their laughter echoing off the rafters before the ceremony began. These were the people who'd trusted me with classified intelligence in places that would make my father's federal courtroom look like a playground. They had earned their seats here. My parents' reserved seats in the front row sat empty, but that row wasn't entirely vacant. Next to the spaces reserved for Judge and Mrs. Horton sat a man who seemed completely out of place. He was older, perhaps in his mid-60s, dressed in a worn cardigan and corduroy pants that spoke of university lecture halls rather than military weddings. He was quiet, his weathered hands resting peacefully in his lap, but there was an unmistakable air of wisdom about him. And then there were his eyes. When he looked up and caught my gaze, offering a gentle, knowing smile, it sent electricity down my spine. They were my father's eyes, the same sharp, penetrating blue. But where my father's held the cold calculation of a lifetime prosecutor, this man's held deep, settled kindness. He was my guest of honor. He was the reason for everything that was about to unfold. Just before the processional music started, my maid of honor, Lieutenant Rodriguez, handed me my phone. "It's your mother," she whispered, her brow creased with concern. I nodded, maintaining the composed mask I'd perfected over 32 years of living under judicial scrutiny. I stepped into the small vestibule, the heavy oak door closing behind me, shutting out the chapel's warmth. I answered. "This is Sabrina." Her voice wasn't warm. It was never warm. It was polished steel, the kind you find in a surgeon's instruments, precise, cold, functional. "Sabrina." No greeting. No "how are you feeling?" No acknowledgement that this was my wedding day. "I'm calling to inform you that your father and I will not be attending." It wasn't an apology. It was a legal verdict delivered with the emotional investment of reading a parking ticket. "His presiding over a landmark environmental case," she continued, her voice gaining that familiar edge of righteous authority. "The implications for federal environmental law will be significant for decades. He cannot afford to be seen away from the bench during deliberations." I remained silent, knowing what was coming. "He wanted me to tell you," she added, her tone sharpening like a blade being honed, "that he will not allow 4 generations of judicial legacy to be compromised by one reckless emotional decision." Reckless. Emotional. The words hung between us like a gavel's final strike. At 32 years old, a Marine Corps intelligence captain who had analyzed threat assessments that kept senators alive, who had made strategic decisions under enemy fire, I was still just an impulsive child making poor choices in their courtroom of family judgment. Marrying Marcus, a man with calloused hands and more integrity in his work boots than my father had in his entire black robe, wasn't a strategic alliance. It was an embarrassment, a stain on the perfect family portrait hanging in judicial chambers across the country. Maya Angelou once wrote, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." I had given my parents hundreds of first times. This was simply the last. "I understand," I said, those two words severing the final thread that had bound us together. I didn't wait for her response. I ended the call. The reception afterward was perfect. Not perfect in my parents' world of carefully orchestrated political gatherings. It was perfect in my world. We held it at a ranch outside Henderson, under strings of warm lights as the Nevada sun painted the desert mountains gold and crimson. The air was thick with the smoky aroma of mesquite-grilled steaks and the sound of mariachi music mixing with country classics. Marcus, my husband, had his strong arm wrapped around my waist, his laughter the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. For a moment, I simply absorbed it all. This was real. This was mine. Then I moved with military precision. "Colonel Mitchell," I called to my commanding officer, a formidable woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much but still held compassion. She approached with her characteristic confident stride. I pulled Marcus close, then gestured to my guest of honor. "Sir," I said softly to the quiet man in the cardigan, "would you mind joining us for a photograph?" His kind eyes twinkled with understanding. "It would be my honor, Sabrina." We positioned ourselves carefully, Marcus and I in the center, radiating newlywed joy. Colonel Mitchell to one side, representing the life of service and honor I had chosen. And on the other side, the scholarly gentleman in the worn cardigan, representing a truth my parents had buried for decades. I raised my phone, captured the image, and looked at the result. It was a portrait of my happiness. It was also a perfectly crafted weapon. I opened our family group chat, a digital space usually dominated by my sister's corporate law firm victories and my father's press releases about landmark rulings. I attached the photo without commentary. No words were necessary. I hit send. For 3 minutes, there was silence. Then my phone began vibrating against the wooden table like an angry rattlesnake. The screen lit up, Victoria Horton calling. I ignored it. It stopped, then immediately started again. Judge Harrison Horton. A pause, then another buzz. Penelope Horton. One after another, the calls came in frantic succession, a cascade of judicial panic from their pristine world of federal courtrooms and marble chambers. They had seen the man in the photograph, and they knew exactly what he represented. They knew the story he could tell. The story that could unravel everything. I looked at my phone displaying my father's name with an urgency he had never once shown for my happiness, my achievements, or my pain. A slow smile spread across my face. I picked up the phone not to answer, but to hand it to Marcus. He looked at me, saw the victory in my eyes, and took it without question. With a simple press of his thumb, he powered it off. The frantic buzzing stopped. All that remained was the sound of our friend's celebration and the gentle desert evening breeze. The game had completely changed. My gaze drifted from my husband's loving face to the man sitting quietly at a nearby table, nursing a glass of local wine. He had my father's eyes, those same eyes that had looked at me with such disappointment for years. But his were kind. I remember the first time I saw that kindness, on a day when I thought I had nowhere left to turn. The invisible scars are always the ones that hurt the most. They don't bleed, they don't bruise, but they ache with the memory of every cold verdict, every dismissive ruling. My childhood was a collection of such scars, a carefully mapped geography of my own inadequacy as measured by judicial standards. I remember when I was 17, I had spent months preparing for the National Mock Trial Championship. It was complex, demanding, and I led our team to victory at the state level. I came home clutching the gold medal and a scholarship offer to Georgetown Law, my heart pounding with fragile, hopeful pride. I found my father in his study, reviewing briefs for an upcoming federal case. He glanced up when I entered, his eyes scanning the medal in my hands. He gave a single curt nod. "Adequate," he said, his attention already returning to his legal documents. But Penelope just made junior partner at her firm 2 years ahead of schedule. Now that's how you build a legal legacy. And just like that, my months of intellectual preparation, my passion, my achievement all evaporated. It was rendered worthless next to my younger sister's corporate success. In the Horton family, intelligence was expected, but advancement was currency, and I was always bankrupt. My father's cruelty was a sharp, precise gavel strike. But my mother's was a slow-acting judicial poison. She was the architect of our family's pristine image, built on the foundation of my silence. Some of my most vivid memories are of dinners at the Metropolitan Club in downtown D.C. It was my father's preferred courtroom. Surrounded by crystal chandeliers and the hushed clinking of silverware on bone china, he would put me on trial. He'd cross-examine me on current events, on legal precedents, on constitutional theory. It wasn't a conversation, it was a deposition. Other judicial families at nearby tables would smile politely, oblivious to the legal execution taking place. If I answered correctly, he would simply move on to the next question. But if I faltered, if I offered a perspective that challenged his judicial philosophy, he wouldn't raise his voice. He would just look at me, a cold, heavy stare of professional disappointment that pinned me to my chair and made the lobster taste like sawdust in my mouth. It was public humiliation designed to remind me of my place in his courtroom of family law. One night, after a particularly brutal dinner interrogation, I followed my mother to her bedroom. I was 15, and tears were streaming down my face. "Why don't you ever object?" I choked out, the words raw with pain I couldn't contain any longer. "Why don't you ever defend me?" She was sitting at her vanity, removing her pearl earrings, the ones that had belonged to a federal judge's wife before her, and another before that. She didn't look at me in the mirror. She just watched her own hands methodically unclasping the jewelry. She sighed, a sound of profound judicial weariness. "Sabrina, don't complicate things unnecessarily," she said, her voice soft but firm. "This family requires order. Justice requires sacrifice even from children." Her order. A peace I had to pay for with pieces of my soul. I realized then that my mother wasn't a passive observer in my father's court. She was a willing co-conspirator. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was a deliberate choice. She had chosen the pearls. She had chosen the status. She had chosen order over her own daughter. The man from the wedding, the one with my father's eyes, I'd seen him once before, like a ghost from a buried case file. I was maybe 11 years old, exploring the dusty law library in our house, when I found an old leather portfolio tucked behind legal encyclopedias. Inside was a photograph I'd never seen. It showed my father, much younger, with his arms around another young man who looked so much like him they could have been identical twins. They were both grinning, leaning against an old Mustang convertible, the very picture of youthful joy, a joy I had never once seen on my father's face. I brought the portfolio downstairs. "Mother," I asked, pointing to the photo, "who is this man with Dad?" The change in her was immediate and terrifying. Her pleasant judicial spouse smile vanished, replaced by a tight, dangerous mask. She snatched the portfolio from my hands. Her fingers, usually so graceful, were like talons as she tore the photograph from its mounting. She ripped it in half, then in half again, and dropped the pieces into the fireplace. "We do not speak of this person," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "Ever. Some cases are permanently sealed." I never asked again. But the image of that smiling man was burned into my memory like evidence entered into the record. The day I finally met him, I was 19. It had been another terrible confrontation with my father. I don't even remember the specific charges, something about my college major. Something about my unrealistic ambitions to join the military instead of law school. He had called my dreams intellectually beneath the family standard and unbecoming of judicial legacy. I had finally shouted back, and the shock on his face was followed by a rage so cold it could have frozen the Supreme Court chambers. I ran. I ran out of the house into a torrential downpour that soaked me to the bone in seconds. I walked aimlessly, tears mixing with rain on my face, until I found myself standing under the dripping awning of a small, quiet bookstore. Scholarly Pursuits and Fine Philosophy, the sign read in faded gold letters. The door opened, and a man stood there. He was older, with streaks of silver in his dark hair and the saddest, kindest eyes I had ever seen. The eyes from the photograph. "You're going to catch pneumonia out there," he said, his voice gentle. "Come in. Let me make you some hot tea." I was so exhausted, so beaten down by years of judicial disappointment, that I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside into a sanctuary that smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and brewing chamomile. He didn't ask my name. He didn't ask why I was crying. He just handed me a warm mug, wrapped a thick wool blanket around my shoulders, and sat in an old armchair across from me. For the first time in my life, someone just listened as the entire story of my cold, perfect childhood poured out of me. He was Professor Elias Horton, my father's older brother, my uncle, the man my family had tried to erase from legal precedent. He never once told me what to do. He never rendered judgment. He just listened. Sitting there in that literary haven, surrounded by the smell of old books and gentle rain, I realized I had a choice. I didn't have to live under my father's judicial gavel forever. But what would a life of my own even look like? And where would I begin to build it? Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's a quiet bookstore in a college town that smells of aging paper and wisdom. Sometimes it's the person who sees the exhaustion behind your eyes and doesn't try to cross-examine you. For me, it was both. And it began with my uncle, Professor Elias Horton. After that first rainy night, his bookstore became my classified sanctuary. Whenever I could escape from the suffocating perfection of judicial life in D.C., I would drive the 3 hours to his small university town. I'd spend afternoons tucked away in a worn leather chair reading philosophy while he worked. He never pressured me to discuss my father. In fact, he rarely mentioned his brother's name. Instead, he taught me things my father never did. He taught me how to listen, not just to prepare your rebuttal, but to truly hear. He taught me how to debate ideas with respect, how to disagree without being disagreeable. My father saw differing opinions as contempt of court. Elias saw them as opportunities for intellectual growth. We'd discuss everything from constitutional philosophy to the novels of Harper Lee. And at the end of our conversations, he would always smile and say, "You have a remarkable mind, Sabrina. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." No one had ever said that to me before. In my father's house, my mind was a tool for performance, for winning arguments, for upholding family reputation. Here, it was valued for its own sake. Sometimes for lunch, he would walk to the cafe next door and bring back 2 turkey and brie sandwiches on thick sourdough bread. We'd eat them right there among the philosophy texts, a simple meal that felt more like home than any of the catered judicial dinners of my childhood. That bookstore wasn't just refuge. It was where I began to rebuild myself from the ground up. It was also where I met Marcus. My beat-up Honda finally gave out one summer afternoon, rattling to a stop just 2 blocks from Elias's store. I called him, frustrated and near tears, and he said, "Don't worry, I know someone reliable." 20 minutes later, a tow truck pulled up and Marcus stepped out. He wasn't what I expected from my father's world of polished attorneys and federal clerks. He was tall and lean with kind eyes and hands marked by honest work. There was a quiet confidence about him, a steadiness. He didn't just diagnose the car problem. As he worked under the hood, he noticed the dark circles under my eyes, the slight tremor in my hands from constant stress. He looked up from the engine and said, "You look like you're carrying a heavy verdict on your shoulders." It was such a simple, direct observation. No judgment, no legal analysis, just a fact. And for some reason, it made me want to cry. He didn't try to solve my problems. He didn't offer counsel. He just saw me. Our first date wasn't at a 5-star restaurant with wine pairings and valet parking. He invited me to his work site, a construction project on the outskirts of town. It was a vast space that smelled of sawdust, metal, and possibility. In a corner, next to heavy equipment, was a small camping table with a Coleman stove. He handed me a cold beer and cooked us hamburgers while he talked about his passion. He wasn't just a construction foreman who built buildings, he was an innovator, an artist who worked with steel and concrete. He described his dream of developing sustainable construction techniques, affordable housing that could withstand natural disasters. His eyes lit up with a fire I found captivating. For the first time, I was with a man who wasn't trying to impress me with his legal connections or political influence. He was impressing me with his purpose. That night, sitting on folding chairs at a construction site, eating a perfectly grilled burger, I felt more seen and valued than I ever had in my father's marble courthouse chambers. This man wasn't trying to reform me or mold me into his ideal. He was just patiently, quietly being present with me. And in his presence, I finally found I could start to heal myself. One evening, a few years later, after Marcus and I had become serious, I was at the bookstore with Elias. It was late, and soft rain was drumming against the windows. I finally asked him the question I had held back for so long. Why did they cut you out, Elias? Why did Dad erase you from family history? He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the rain-slicked street. He looked older in that moment, the sadness in his eyes more pronounced. Your father and I started a legal consulting firm together many years ago, he began, his voice low and measured. We were young, ambitious. Harrison was the courtroom performer, charismatic, ruthless when necessary. I was the researcher, the strategic mind behind the cases. We were an excellent team. He paused, taking a slow sip of his tea. Then a major case came to us, a class action lawsuit against a chemical company that had been dumping toxic waste into groundwater systems. Rural communities, mostly poor, mostly voiceless. The evidence was overwhelming. He looked at me then, his gaze steady and clear. But the chemical company offered us something extraordinary to make the evidence disappear. Not just money, connections, judicial appointments, a pathway to federal positions. It would have made us both very wealthy and very powerful. The story came out in quiet, measured tones, free of bitterness but heavy with ancient sorrow. I said no. I told him we couldn't be part of poisoning innocent families, that it wasn't justice, it was corruption. I tried to convince him to walk away, to represent the victims instead. He reached across the table and placed his weathered hand over mine. But Harrison saw it as his one shot at real power. He told me I was naive, sentimental. He said I was holding back his potential for judicial greatness. The professor's voice grew quieter. So he made a choice. He restructured the firm, used legal loopholes to force me out with almost nothing, and took the case. He helped bury the evidence, the families lost their lawsuit, and he used the money and connections to launch his judicial career. He became federal judge Harrison Horton, and I became the idealistic brother who couldn't handle the real world, a convenient story that everyone in legal circles was happy to believe. His words hung in the quiet air of the bookstore, heavy with unspoken warning. This wasn't just ancient history. It was a map of the future, a future I now realized I was walking directly into. I tell you this not to make you hate your father, Sabrina, Elias said gently. I tell you this so you understand what he values most. He didn't just push me out, he built his entire career on that one decision. And he will do anything to protect it. The peace we'd found in Henderson was quiet and solid, built of shared meals and comfortable silences. But Elias's warning lingered in the back of my mind like an unresolved case. He will do anything to protect it. I just never imagined anything would look like a pristine black Mercedes pulling up to Marcus's dusty construction site. And I certainly never expected my sister Penelope to step out of it. She looked like she'd been transported from another planet. Dressed in a tailored Armani suit and Italian leather heels, she navigated the gravel and construction equipment as if it were a minefield. Her presence was so utterly out of place among the hard hats and bulldozers, it was almost surreal. She was carrying an elegant gift basket from Dean & DeLuca, the kind of expensive piece offering you see in glossy lifestyle magazines, filled with artisanal cheeses and wines that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. Sabrina, she called out, her smile bright and practiced as a courtroom performance. I was in the area and thought I'd stop by. In the area. Henderson, Nevada, was a 6-hour drive from her DC law firm. I leaned against Marcus's work trailer, crossing my arms. Marcus came to stand beside me, wiping concrete dust from his hands with a work rag, his presence a silent, solid wall of support. "Hello, Penelope," I said, my voice flat and professional. Her eyes did a quick, dismissive survey of the construction site, a flicker of distaste crossing her features before being replaced by that relentless legal smile. "And you must be Marcus," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "It's wonderful to finally meet you." Marcus shook her hand, his grip firm and brief. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Penelope launched into her carefully rehearsed presentation. Dad and Mom feel absolutely terrible about missing the wedding, she said, her voice dripping with manufactured legal sincerity. Things have been incredibly demanding with his caseload, but they want to make it right with you, with both of you. She placed the gift basket on Marcus's work table, pushing aside blueprints and measuring tools. They want to host a proper celebration dinner. At the house in Georgetown, a formal reception to welcome you and Uncle Elias back into the family. She painted a beautiful picture of reconciliation, of warm family reunion. But her language was laced with terms I recognized from years of legal training. She kept using phrases like mutual benefit and consolidating our interests and strategic alliance. This wasn't about family. This was a business proposal, and I was the key witness they needed to flip. I just stared at her, my silence making her visibly uncomfortable. She started fidgeting with her briefcase clasp. "Look, Brina," she said, dropping the professional facade slightly. "It would just be better for everyone if we could present a united front. You know how Dad operates. He can't stand the idea of an outsider controlling something so important to the family's interests." And there it was, the slip. The single careless sentence that exposed the entire sham. An outsider controlling something important. My blood turned to ice water. What are you talking about, Penelope? What is Marcus supposedly controlling? After a few more minutes of awkward legal maneuvering, Penelope finally retreated to her pristine German sedan and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust and the cloying scent of expensive perfume in her wake. The construction site was silent except for the distant hum of heavy machinery. The Dean and DeLuca basket sat on the work table like unexploded ordnance. I turned to Marcus. What was that about? What is she talking about, an outsider controlling something important? He looked at me, his kind eyes serious. He took my hands in his work-roughened ones. "Sabrina," he began, his voice steady. "There's something I should have told you earlier. I loved that you fell in love with me when I was just a construction worker." He led me to the back of his work trailer to a door I'd always assumed was equipment storage. He unlocked it and flicked on fluorescent lights. My jaw dropped. It wasn't storage. It was a high-tech laboratory. Clean white walls lined with computer servers, engineering workstations, and complex technical schematics. In the center of the room, on a pristine work surface, was a sleek prototype device glowing with blue LED indicators. "This construction site isn't just a construction site," he said quietly. "It's my headquarters. My name is Dr. Marcus Rivera Santos, and my company is Rivera Defense Systems." The name hit me like a physical blow. Rivera Defense Systems was the mysterious, brilliant startup that had emerged from nowhere and won a massive Pentagon contract for next-generation autonomous defense technology, a $2.3 billion contract that a major defense conglomerate, one my father had significant financial ties to, had been expected to win. Marcus had beaten my father. Demolished his financial expectations. The photo, the frantic phone calls, Penelope's sudden visit, it all clicked into place with sickening clarity. They didn't care about Elias. They didn't care about me. They wanted him. My father couldn't beat Marcus in honest competition, so he was trying to absorb him, to control him through family manipulation. I wasn't the prodigal daughter they wanted back, I was supposed to be the leverage in a hostile takeover. I wasn't shocked that Marcus was brilliant. I'd always known he was extraordinary. What overwhelmed me, what brought tears to my eyes, was the profound realization that this incredible man had loved me when he had nothing to gain from my family name. He had let me believe he was a simple construction worker, and he had valued me for who I was, not for what judicial connections I could provide. He had given me the one thing my own family never had, unconditional love. The dinner invitation wasn't an olive branch. It was a legal trap. It was a corporate acquisition attempt, and I was supposed to be the key asset that sealed the deal. I looked at Marcus, at this good, strong man who was my husband, my partner, my true family. I saw the quiet integrity in his eyes and felt my own resolve harden into something unbreakable. The fear and hurt I had carried for so long finally burned away, leaving behind a cold, clear certainty. If you've ever felt like your value to your family was tied to what you could do for them professionally, please hit that like button to show your support. And in the comments below, just type the words "I see you," because I need to know I'm not alone in this fight. I took a deep breath, the smell of concrete dust and steel filling my lungs. It was the smell of my real life, my authentic home. "I'm going," I said, my voice quiet but firm. But not to reconcile. I looked him straight in the eyes. "I'm going to end this." Walking into my childhood home in Georgetown was like entering a perfectly preserved legal museum. Everything was exactly as I remembered: the gleaming hardwood floors, the impossibly high ceilings, the suffocating silence that clung to every surface like accumulated legal precedent. Every piece of furniture was positioned with courtroom precision. Every law book was arranged alphabetically. Every surface reflected the cold perfection of a life lived entirely for appearances. It was a beautiful house. It had never been a home. My father, Federal Judge Harrison Horton, greeted us at the front door, his face arranged in a mask of paternal warmth that didn't quite reach his judicial eyes. My mother, Victoria, stood beside him in her signature pearls and a cashmere dress, the perfect judicial spouse. "Sabrina, darling," she exclaimed, air-kissing the space beside my cheek like we were at a legal fundraiser. The performance began immediately. My father clapped Marcus on the shoulder with calculated familiarity. "Marcus, my boy," he boomed. "I've been hearing remarkable things about your hidden talents." The word hidden was laced with subtle condescension, as if Marcus had been a clever legal trick he'd only just discovered. Then he turned to Elias, the brother he had financially destroyed and socially exiled for over 30 years. He smiled a wide, political smile. "Elias, it's been far too long. Welcome home, brother." He said it as if they had simply lost touch over scheduling conflicts, as if Elias had been on an extended sabbatical instead of living in forced academic obscurity. I watched my uncle's face remain perfectly neutral, his quiet dignity a shield against the staggering hypocrisy of the moment. I felt nauseous. This wasn't a family reunion. It was a legal negotiation, and we were the opposing counsel. Dinner was served in the formal dining room under a crystal chandelier that cast sharp light onto the polished mahogany table. The meal was an elaborate multi-course affair catered by one of DC's most expensive restaurants. The wine was a vintage that cost more per bottle than Marcus's construction workers made in a day. Everything was designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind us of the power we were challenging. Throughout the meal, my father held court like a presiding judge, delivering a series of thinly veiled legal arguments disguised as casual conversation. Each comment was a carefully aimed cross-examination question. "It's reassuring that Sabrina found a man who can provide for her," he said to the table, swirling red wine in his crystal glass. "That military career, noble, certainly, but it doesn't exactly lead to judicial appointment or significant financial security, does it?" He was dismissing my service, my rank, my entire identity, reducing it to a quaint but unprofitable hobby. He turned his prosecutorial attention to Marcus. "So, construction work in a small desert town. Quite the American success story. It's amazing what a little luck and the right legal connections can do for an ambitious man." He was painting Marcus's genius as a fluke while subtly positioning himself as the right connection Marcus now desperately needed. Marcus smiled politely, taking a sip of water. Elias remained silent, observing like a scholar taking notes. I ate my salmon, each bite tasting like courthouse cafeteria food. I didn't say a word. I just watched my father with narrowed eyes, cataloging every manipulation, every legal strategy. I was a Marine intelligence officer conducting reconnaissance, mapping enemy positions before the final battle. After dinner, my father led the men into his study. "Let's discuss the real business," he said with booming false cheer. My mother tried to guide me toward the living room for coffee and small talk, but I shook my head. "No. I'll be joining the legal conference." The study, the same room where he had cross-examined me, humiliated me, and broken my spirit more times than I could count. The same mahogany desk, the same leather chairs, the same oppressive smell of old legal volumes and accumulated power. My father sat behind his judicial desk like a federal judge calling court to order. He gestured for Marcus and Elias to sit. I remained standing by the door, a bailiff observing the proceedings. He wasted no time with pleasantries. Marcus, he leaned forward like a predator closing in on key testimony. Your technology is revolutionary. Truly extraordinary. But technology alone isn't sufficient to operate at the federal level you're capable of reaching. You need political protection. You need legal access. You need institutional credibility. He steepled his fingers in his classic judicial pose. I have a proposal. Merge Rivera Defense Systems with a subsidiary of Hartwell Morrison Defense, a company I have significant legal and financial interests in. You'll maintain creative control, naturally, but you'll have the full weight of our political and legal capital behind your innovations. There it was, the hostile takeover bid wrapped in familial concern. You have the brilliance, I have the power. Together, we'd be an unstoppable legal and financial alliance. He sat back, confident he'd just delivered a closing argument that no reasonable person could refuse. The silence in the room was absolute. Marcus didn't look intimidated or impressed. He looked calm, centered, thoughtful. He listened patiently until my father finished his legal presentation. Judge Horton, Marcus said, his voice respectful but firm. I appreciate the offer, but my company's core values are independence and innovation. I built Rivera Defense Systems specifically to challenge the kind of corporate monopoly you're describing. I'm afraid I'm going to have to respectfully decline. The silence that followed was deafening. My father's confident smile froze, then slowly dissolved like ice in summer heat. His eyes, which had been feigning judicial warmth all evening, turned to chips of courtroom ice. He stared at Marcus for a long moment, as if he couldn't process what he'd just heard. Rejection was not a language Federal Judge Harrison Horton understood. Then his head snapped toward me like a whip crack. The fury that had been simmering beneath his judicial composure all evening finally erupted. His face twisted into a mask of pure rage, the same rage I'd witnessed 100 times in this very room. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice rising to a roar that would have been contempt of court in his own chambers. You, he bellowed, his words bouncing off the law books lining the walls. It's always you, the defiant one, the one who has to destroy every opportunity this family creates. He slammed his fist on the mahogany desk, the sound like a gavel striking in final judgment. I should have known, he raged, his eyes burning with decades of accumulated judicial fury. I should have known you'd poison him with your anti-establishment military nonsense. And there it was, the final verdict. The one accusation that connected every scar, every humiliation, every moment of worthlessness he had ever inflicted on me. I was the virus in his perfect legal system, the dissenting opinion that threatened his entire judicial legacy. The sound of my own breaking point was deafening silence. In the absolute quiet that followed my father's judicial rage, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a loud, violent snap, it was a quiet, final click, like a lock settling into place after 32 years of trying to force the wrong key. The fear that had lived in my bones since childhood simply evaporated, leaving behind a calm so profound it felt like ice water in my veins. I lifted my head and looked directly at him, not as a daughter seeking approval, not as a defendant begging for mercy, but as an equal officer of justice calling his court to order. My voice, when it came, was not a shout. It was low, steady, and dangerously calm. No, Judge Horton, I said, using his formal title like a weapon. I don't destroy opportunities. You destroy people. The words hung in the air like toxic evidence finally admitted into the record. You destroyed my childhood with your psychological warfare conducted in this very room. My father's face, contorted with rage, slackened into stunned disbelief. My mother let out a tiny gasp from the doorway. Penelope, who had crept into the study at the sound of shouting, froze like a defendant caught perjuring herself. Don't you dare make false accusations, Sabrina, my mother whispered, her voice trembling. Your father was simply maintaining high standards. High standards. The phrase was so pathetic, so legally inadequate, it was almost laughable. It was the lie she had told herself for decades, the flimsy legal fiction she had used to hide from the ugly truth. I turned my cold gaze on her. High standards. I repeated, my voice devoid of any emotion except surgical precision. Is that what you call the family trials you allowed him to conduct? I took a step toward her. She shrank back against the doorframe. I remember being 12 years old, standing in this room for 2 hours while he cross-examined me about why I got a B+ in advanced placement history. I remember being sentenced to isolation in my room without dinner because I dared to express a different opinion about constitutional interpretation. I let the testimony settle into the record. I remember every single psychological scar you chose not to see, every moment of emotional abuse you decided was just high standards. I turned back to my mother, delivering the final damning evidence. And you, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more power than any shout. You were there. You heard everything. You saw a child being systematically broken down by a man drunk on his own power, and you chose your pearls and your social standing over your own daughter. I paused, letting the verdict resonate through the room. Your silence hurt more than his psychological torture ever could. My mother made a small, wounded sound like an animal finally caught in a trap of her own making. She clutched her pearl necklace as if it were a lifeline, her knuckles white with the desperate grip of someone drowning in their own choices. For the first time in my life, she looked completely broken. I turned my back on them both and walked to Marcus's side. I took his hand, our fingers lacing together in a silent declaration of where my true loyalty lay. I looked back at my father, whose face had become a slack-jawed mask of impotent judicial authority. This man, I said, my voice ringing with clarity I had never felt before, the man you dismiss as just a construction worker, taught me what respect and kindness actually feel like. He gave me the safety you never provided. He sees value in me that you were never capable of understanding, a value that has nothing to do with your name, your money, or your federal judicial position. I felt Marcus squeeze my hand, his strength flowing into me like reinforcement arriving on a battlefield. I felt Elias's quiet presence behind me, a pillar of intellectual integrity. I was no longer a girl standing alone before a tyrannical judge. I was a woman flanked by her chosen family. I didn't come here tonight to seek your approval, I stated, my eyes locked on my father's. I didn't come to negotiate a plea bargain. I came to inform you of my final judgment. I took one last steadying breath. As of this moment, you hold no authority over my life. You are not my commanding officer. You are not my father. You are just a corrupt politician in a room full of expensive furniture bought with dirty money. The finality in my voice was absolute, not a request for clemency, but a verdict from which there would be no appeal. And we are leaving. Without another word, I turned. Marcus and Elias turned with me in perfect formation. We walked 3 abreast toward the door, a united front retreating from enemy territory. We didn't look back. I could feel the chaos erupting in the silence behind us, Penelope frozen in the doorway watching her perfect world crumble, my mother beginning to sob with the hollow, empty sound of a lifetime of choices finally demanding payment, and my father experiencing the crushing weight of complete, utter powerlessness for perhaps the first time in his judicial career. We walked through the grand foyer, past the expensive art and polished mirrors reflecting our dignified withdrawal. Marcus opened the heavy front door, and cool night air washed over us like absolution. It felt like my first breath of truly free air. We didn't run. We walked with calm, deliberate pace down the stone steps and onto the quiet Georgetown street. We didn't speak until we reached our rental car. Behind us, the heavy oak door of the Horton house slammed shut with the finality of a gavel's last strike. But this time, I was the one who had rendered the final verdict. The drive back to Henderson from D.C. was the quietest 6 hours of my life. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt empty, the hollow, peaceful emptiness of a courtroom after a long case finally reaches resolution. The battle for my own soul had been won, but the cost was the complete, surgical amputation of my legal family. It was necessary, like removing a malignant tumor, but phantom pain still ached where those bonds used to be. When we got home, the first thing I did was take out my phone. I scrolled to my mother's contact information. Her picture, a professionally taken photo of her and my father at a judicial fundraiser, stared back at me with practiced perfection. I pressed block number. I did the same for my father. For Penelope. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of legal procedure, sealing the case file, preventing further contamination. It was building a firewall between my new life and their toxic influence. My silence would be the strongest testimony I could offer. We settled back into our life in Henderson. The quiet rhythm was healing to my battle-worn nerves, early morning runs through the desert, the smell of coffee brewing, the familiar sounds of Marcus's work. This was real life, built on honesty and mutual respect rather than image and accumulated power. For the first time, I felt a peace that was genuine, not one purchased with my silence and compliance, but earned through courage and authenticity. But the aftershocks of our courtroom explosion in D.C. were beginning to ripple outward through the legal and political world. A few weeks later, I was reading news on my laptop when I saw a headline in Legal Affairs Weekly: Judge Horton's influence wanes as Pentagon favors tech outsider. The article detailed how my father had failed to secure the lucrative defense contract for Hartwell Morrison Defense. It mentioned that the contract had gone to an innovative small firm called Rivera Defense Systems. Political analysts were questioning whether the federal judge was losing his legendary influence. His financial backers were getting nervous about their investments. I felt a grim satisfaction. I hadn't fired a shot in this battle. My father's empire was cracking under the weight of its own arrogance and corruption. He had tried to acquire the future through manipulation, and when that failed, the future simply moved beyond his reach. The consequences weren't just professional. They hit our family in ways I hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, my phone rang with an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, then saw a text: "Brina, please pick up. It's Penelope." With a heavy sigh, I called her back. The voice on the other end wasn't the confident legal professional I knew. It was the broken, desperate sob of someone whose entire world had just been demolished by an earthquake. "He called it off," she wailed without preamble. "Jonathan's family, they ended the engagement." Jonathan was Penelope's fiancé, heir to a hotel and real estate fortune. Their wedding was supposed to be the social event of the legal season, the ultimate merger of two powerful DC dynasties. His father said our family's long-term stability and reputation were compromised, she cried. "It's because of Dad losing that defense contract." "I know it is. And it's all your fault, you ruined everything." There it was, the familiar legal strategy. Even in her personal devastation, her first instinct was to find someone else to blame for the consequences of our father's actions. The old Sabrina would have absorbed that guilt like a sponge. The old Sabrina would have apologized and tried to fix everything. The new Sabrina just listened. I let her vent all her anger, fear, and frustration. I didn't defend myself. I didn't argue her case. I just stayed on the line, a silent, steady presence while she worked through her pain. There was no satisfaction in her suffering. I wasn't celebrating her downfall. Seeing my sister, the golden child who had always floated through life on privilege, so utterly broken just made me sad. Sad for the hollow values she'd been raised to worship. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, I spoke gently but firmly. "Penelope," I said, "I'm sorry you're hurting." She was quiet for a moment, probably shocked that I wasn't yelling back or mounting a legal defense. "But I can't fix this for you," I continued. "I won't call Jonathan's family, and I won't try to smooth things over with Mom and Dad. That world, that life, it's not mine anymore. So you're just going to abandon me?" she asked, her voice thick with disbelief. "No," I said. "I'm not abandoning you. If you want to build a life of your own, a real one, I'll help you. I'll help you write a resume. I can make some calls to help you find meaningful work, maybe in public interest law. I can help you learn to stand on your own merit instead of family connections." I paused, letting the offer settle. "But I will not return to that house, and I will not engage with Mom and Dad. That's my boundary, non-negotiable." Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members to protect your own peace? It's one of the hardest and most necessary things we can do. If you understand this decision, please give this a like and write "Boundaries Matter" in the comments. Penelope was silent, processing an offer based on genuine support rather than manipulation or family obligation. "I have to go, Penelope," I said finally. The offer stands. You know how to reach me. I hung up. I hadn't punished her. I hadn't gloated. I had used my newfound freedom not as a weapon, but as a tool to build a bridge, one she could choose to cross, but one that stopped firmly at the boundaries of my own hard-won peace. But as I sat there, I began to realize that the consequences of that confrontation were bigger than just family drama. The cracks in my father's empire were becoming visible to the entire legal and political establishment. They say a house built on corrupt foundation will eventually collapse under its own weight. I didn't have to push it. I didn't have to set it on fire. I just had to step away and let justice, real justice, do its work. The first major tremor came about a month after our dinner confrontation. It arrived not as dramatic courtroom theater, but as a headline on the Washington Post homepage. I was drinking morning coffee when Marcus slid his laptop across our kitchen table. "You should see this," he said quietly. The headline was stark: "The Judge's Original Sin, How Harrison Horton Built a Career on Environmental Cover-Up." It was a meticulously researched piece of investigative journalism, the kind that wins Pulitzer Prizes and ends careers. The reporter had spent months digging into my father's early legal work, following paper trails and interviewing sources that had stayed silent for decades. The article laid out in excruciating detail the story Elias had told me in his bookstore: the environmental lawsuit, the toxic waste cover-up, the betrayal of his own brother for power and money. It had names, dates, copies of sealed legal documents, and testimonies from family members of the victims who had been silenced for 30 years. It was Elias's story, finally brought into the harsh light of public scrutiny. The article never mentioned my name. It never referenced our family dinner. It didn't need to. It was simply the truth, documented and verified, presented to the American people who deserved to know that one of their federal judges had built his career on buried evidence and poisoned communities. And truth, it turns out, is a wrecking ball. My phone started ringing almost immediately, not my family this time, but reporters. New York Times, CNN, Legal Affairs Network. They all wanted statements, reactions, inside information about growing up as the daughter of a corrupt federal judge. They wanted me to pour gasoline on the fire that was already consuming everything my father had built. I didn't answer a single call. Marcus and I unplugged our landline, put our cells on silent. Our silence was more powerful than any statement we could have made. It was tacit confirmation without active participation. We didn't need to join the chorus of legal condemnation. My father's enemies, and a lifetime of ruthless judicial politics had created many, were more than happy to do that work. His empire was burning, and he had struck the match himself 30 years ago. The fallout was swift and devastating. Within a week, legal ethics organizations were calling for investigations. Within 2 weeks, federal oversight committees had launched formal inquiries. The story dominated legal news cycles for months. He was no longer federal Judge Harrison Horton, the powerful legal figure. He was Harrison Horton, the corrupt official who had betrayed environmental justice for personal gain. His reputation, the one thing he had valued above family, above integrity, above everything, lay in ashes. 2 weeks after the article published, he held a press conference. I watched it on a small TV in Marcus's work trailer, surrounded by the honest smell of construction and innovation. He stood at a podium looking older, smaller, deflated. He announced his resignation from the federal bench, effective immediately, citing the need to focus on personal and family matters. It was one last lie, one final piece of legal theater. But nobody was buying tickets to his show anymore. The financial empire followed the political one into collapse. The legal consulting firm at the heart of the scandal was hit with a tsunami of lawsuits from families whose communities had been poisoned. Environmental justice organizations, armed with decades of buried evidence, filed case after case. The Horton family fortune, built on that single act of environmental betrayal, began hemorrhaging money faster than a punctured artery. The perfect judicial family portrait had been shredded. The pieces scattered to the wind. They had lost everything they had valued most: the power, the money, the pristine reputation. And in losing those things, they discovered they had nothing else left. Amidst this legal and financial storm, a single piece of correspondence arrived in our Nevada mailbox. It was a simple cream envelope addressed to me in familiar, elegant script. But the return address wasn't the grand Georgetown house. It was a small post office box in a rural Virginia town I'd never heard of. Inside was a single sheet of matching stationery from my mother. She didn't offer excuses. She didn't ask for pity. She didn't even apologize in the traditional sense. Her words were simple, stark, stripped of all legal maneuvering and social pretense. "Sabrina," she wrote, "I was wrong. I spent my entire adult life helping your father build a legal empire, and I forgot to help build a family. I have left him. I don't know where my life goes from here, but I know I cannot stay in that house of lies anymore. I understand if you never want to see me again. Victoria." I read the letter 3 times. My father's downfall had brought me a cold, clear sense of justice being served. But this was different. This was just profoundly sad. It was the wreckage of a life laid bare in 4 simple sentences. It was the confession of a woman who had awakened at the end of her marriage to find herself living in a beautiful, empty museum of her own complicity. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was just stating facts as cold and hard as the truth that had just torn our family apart. Forgiveness wasn't on the table yet. But for the first time in my life, I wondered what might be possible. My mother's letter sat on our kitchen counter for 3 weeks. I'd pass it each morning, see her handwriting, and feel a complicated knot of emotions tighten in my chest. It wasn't anger anymore, it was something quieter, more complex. Marcus never pressured me. He'd see me looking at it and simply say, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." His support was the solid ground beneath my feet, giving me courage to finally make a choice. I realized the decision wasn't about her. It was about me. I wrote back a brief note with a time and address, a small coffee shop halfway between her new town and Henderson. The woman who sat across from me in that bright cafe was someone I barely recognized. The perfect judicial spouse styling was gone, replaced by soft, unstyled hair showing natural gray roots. The designer clothes had been swapped for a simple sweater and jeans that looked like they came from a regular department store. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother without her armor. No makeup masked the tired lines around her eyes. No pearls gleamed at her throat as symbols of her legal status. She looked older. She looked exhausted. And she looked more real than she ever had before. We started with awkward small talk, the weather, the coffee, the long drive. It felt like building a fragile bridge over a vast canyon of unspoken history. Then she began to talk about her new life. She had a small apartment in a college town. She was working part-time at the local library. She was taking a pottery class, something she'd always wanted to try but never had time for during the years of judicial entertaining. It was a small, quiet life, the kind she'd been raised to look down upon as beneath her social station. "I was a coward, Sabrina," she said, her eyes fixed on her coffee mug. She wasn't making excuses or building legal defenses. She was stating a fact. "I was so terrified of your father, of losing the life his position provided, that I stopped being your mother. I just played the role he assigned me in his perfect judicial household." She finally looked up, and her eyes held a shame so profound it seemed to physically hurt. "There is no excuse for what I allowed to happen to you in that house. I know that. I can't legal brief my way out of 30 years of choosing comfort over courage." I listened without interrupting. I let her truth, broken, ugly, honest truth, fill the space between us. As I listened, I felt the last of the hardened anger inside me begin to soften. Not into forgiveness yet, but into something like sad understanding. We sat in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the espresso machine and quiet conversation from other tables. "I forgive you," I said, and the words felt strange and new on my tongue. She looked up, startled, tears welling in her eyes. "Sabrina, you don't have to." "I know," I interrupted gently. "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me." I leaned forward, my voice quiet but clear. "I forgive you because I deserve to have peace. I forgive you because I cannot carry this anger for the rest of my life. It's too heavy, and I have better things to build." I saw hope flicker in her eyes, and I knew I had to establish boundaries immediately before that hope could grow into dangerous expectations. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, I continued steadily. There is no going back to the way things were. We can't erase the scars or pretend the damage didn't happen. I laid out the new terms clearly. We can start over, but it will be slow. There will be no more performances, no more pretending everything is fine. There will only be honesty. And you have to respect my life, my husband, my home, and my peace. You have to respect my boundaries. She nodded, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. It wasn't a Hollywood movie reconciliation. It was something much more real, the beginning of a fragile, tentative relationship built not on shared history, but on mutual respect for hard-won truth. After another moment of quiet, she asked the question I knew was coming, her voice barely a whisper. And your father? I didn't have to think about my answer. The decision had been made in the cold silence of his study months ago. I shook my head slowly. I have nothing to say to him, I said. I hope he finds some kind of peace eventually, but I will not be the one to offer it to him. That door was closed, locked, and the key had been melted down for scrap metal. It was the healthiest, most necessary decision of my life. I was no longer waiting for the father I wished I'd had. I was accepting the one I got and choosing to walk away from his toxicity. Driving away from that coffee shop, I felt something I hadn't expected, not sadness or anger, but quiet resolution. I had closed one door permanently and cracked open another one carefully. But the most important door was the one in front of me, leading back to Marcus and the life we were actively creating together. The sunrises in Henderson are different from the ones in D.C. In Washington, the sun seems to struggle through haze of ambition and political maneuvering. Here, it just arrives, spilling golden and clean over the desert mountains, promising nothing more complicated than a new day. And for the first time in my life, that's all I need. It's been 5 years since that dinner confrontation. 5 years of quiet, steady, beautiful life built on authenticity rather than image. I'm still a captain in the Marines, but something fundamental has changed. I no longer wear the uniform as armor to hide from family expectations. I wear it with simple, genuine pride. It's part of who I am, not an escape from who I was supposed to be. Our house isn't a mansion. It's a sprawling ranch with a big backyard, usually scattered with Marcus's prototype equipment and our children's toys. Our twins Emma and Sophia have Marcus's kind eyes and my stubborn determination. They're 4 years old, and our home is loud with the sound of their questions, their laughter, their complete and joyful chaos. It is perfectly imperfect. It is safe. Just last week, I was helping Emma build a complex Lego space station. She was getting frustrated, trying to force a piece where it didn't belong. The plastic wouldn't click into place, and she let out an angry little growl, her small face clouding with disappointment. She balled her tiny fist and was about to demolish the whole construction. "It's stupid," she yelled. In that moment, a ghost of memory flickered through me, the memory of cold judicial stares, of my father's disappointed sighs, of feeling fundamentally inadequate and wrong. The old family programming, the cycle of perfectionism and punishment, was right there waiting to continue into another generation. But cycles only continue until someone is brave enough to break them. I knelt down on the carpet, getting on her level. I didn't grab the toy away or tell her to stop being difficult. I just looked into her frustrated little eyes. "It's not stupid, sweetheart," I said softly. "It's just tricky. It's okay to feel frustrated. Let's figure it out together." She looked at me, her small brow still furrowed, but her fist slowly uncurled. We worked on it together, and when the piece finally snapped into place, her face lit up with triumphant joy that was pure sunshine. In that small, ordinary moment, sitting on our living room floor, I knew I had won the most important battle of my life. I was not my father's daughter anymore. I was Emma and Sophia's mother, and I would never let them doubt their worth. Today is a sunny Saturday, and our backyard is full of real family. Uncle Elias is here, his kind eyes crinkling as he watches the girls chase butterflies through the desert plants. My mother Victoria is here too, our relationship still careful and limited, but built on honesty now instead of performance. She comes to visit every few months, and there's genuine warmth between us, even if trust is still being rebuilt one conversation at a time. My sister Penelope is here as well. After her engagement collapsed, she took my offer of help. She left corporate law and became a public defender, using her legal skills to help the families our father's corruption had harmed. She has her own small apartment and is building a life based on her values instead of family expectations. The entitled girl is gone, replaced by a woman who's still finding her way but doing it authentically. And Marcus, he's at the grill, flipping burgers and laughing at something Elias said about quantum physics. He's still the same man who won my heart at a construction site. Rivera Defense Systems is now a major defense contractor, but you'd never know it. Success hasn't changed his core character. Last year, we used company profits to establish the Elias Horton Foundation, providing scholarships for engineering students from underserved communities. It's our way of transforming a legacy of betrayal into one of opportunity and justice. I look around at this chaotic, beautiful, authentic collection of people in my backyard. This is my family, not the one I was born into, but the one I chose and built with intention. My father taught me that image was everything. He was wrong. Love is everything. Safety is everything. Honesty, patience, integrity, these are the materials that build a real life. And the freedom to be your own flawed, authentic self, that is the only real power in this world. I am a Marine. 4 years, I fought a war on the wrong battlefield, trying to win approval that was never going to come. But now, finally, I have found my way home to the life I was meant to live. My journey to authentic peace is complete. But I know that for many of you, it might just be beginning. If any part of my story resonated with you, the feeling of never being enough, the fight for your own truth, or the joy of building chosen family, please know you are not alone. This channel is dedicated to stories that remind us of our own strength and our power to break toxic cycles. If you believe in that mission, please subscribe and share this story with someone who might need to hear that they, too, can find their way home to themselves.